Okay, so I don't have slides, but I do have my notes on my iPad I'll be referring to, so thank you, Julian. Okay, so yeah, taking the theme that was sent about today, I'm going to cover two topics. The role that technology leadership plays during the M&A process, and what does it look like to work in an organisation that is heavily acquisitive. Now, based on the scores, I can tell a lot of you have obviously got a huge amount of experience, so some of this might be quite basic, but hopefully some of these fundamental principles should be some value for you. So my interpretation is going to be the typical high-level process, which I'm going to talk through, and specifically through the lens of technology, and also answer the question, why would you want to work for an organisation that makes a lot of acquisitions or is busy in M&A? Or also, why wouldn't somebody want to work in a company that's very acquisitive? Okay, so my current role, so I'm an IT director at the moment. I work for Johnson Controls, which are a $30 billion global organisation. My piece of the pie is the UK and Ireland businesses, which are the ones you would probably typically know would be ADT Fire and Security, Tyco Fire Suppression, and our HVAC business. And we also have a big building controls and digital business, which essentially digitizes the controls of buildings and helps organizations towards their sustainability targets. I have a remit across 10 countries, South America, Central America, and Europe, along with our UK&I businesses. And all of those businesses combined contribute about $1.5 billion worth of revenue for the organization. They're also extremely acquisitive. They buy lots and lots of companies. I've also previously worked for other organizations that have also been very, very busy in M&A. So I've been involved in about 30 plus deals, right from target identification all the way through to full transition. So hopefully I'm quite well placed to talk about some of the learnings. Okay, so I asked some tips from a friend that's done this type of thing before, and one of the tips he said was start with a question, don't answer it, and then come back to it halfway through. So we're going to try that. If it doesn't work, it's his fault. If it works well, then great. So the question I came up with was, what do you think is the most critical factor which will determine whether or not an acquisition is successful? So that's the question, and we'll come back to that later and see if anyone's got an answer. So what's the process? Obviously, the process looks slightly different for everyone else, and you'll all have, I'm sure, a playbook or templates, but really, really high level. I'm going to start with target identification. So what type of company do we want to buy? Due diligence. So we've got someone that we want to take a closer look at. Target operating model, stroke planning. So if we buy this company, what does that look like? How do they fit into our organization, or the two companies work together? What's that going to look like? And then you've got either completion or cancellation. And then I've called it first 30. So in my mind, it's what do we do in that first 30 days? What are the absolutely critical immediate tasks that we do? And then it's longer term, and longer term could be 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, 10 years. So let's start with target identification. So obviously, there's lots of different types of deals, and I'm sure that most of you know this, but I'm going to go through just in case. So obviously, we've got the most common, which would be an acquisition. That's the bulk of where my experience lies. So that's predominantly what I'll talk about today. But also, you've got mergers. I think Andy touched on an example where two organisations of similar size are coming together, and that comes with different challenges. You've also got a joint venture where two organisations will create a new legal entity and work together to create value, or also divestitures as well, so selling an organization. So different types of targets. So Andy gave some amazing examples of all of these, but I think quite often, and in my experience, the IT and technology teams are kind of brought in slightly later in the stage. So, I think I was talking to, Liz, you gave me a great example earlier where it's a case of we talk about the value, and then suddenly once the company's bought, it's right, what do we do with the systems? And quite often I've seen that. So my biggest tip would be do whatever we can to be involved in the target identification. Why are we buying businesses? It could be for the value in the product. It could be that it's in a geographical presence. It could be that it's in a vertical market that we don't have a presence in at the moment. It could be that there's one big customer that's been evading us for 10 years and we know they're serviced by a small local organization, and it's a foot in the door to go and work with that company and acquire them. And these are all classic examples of why someone would buy a company. But from a technology lens, this is so critical, because I think that and establishing that at the start should define all of our decision making throughout the whole process, where we show our focus. M&A is such a vast area. It's so easy to get wrong. So when we know the value that this company is bringing, it basically defines where we focus. So let's say we've targeted a company, we want to take a closer look. We think maybe the product fits in our portfolio. For one of the reasons we talked about, we're moving into due diligence. And again, at this point, a quick overview of my experience. So in terms of the size of the organizations that I've been typically involved in, on the smaller side, in terms of revenue, you're looking between 2 and 5 million. On the big side, closer to 180 million, just to give you an idea of size, because I know some of you will have worked on much bigger deals and some of you slightly smaller. But in that maybe SME to small to medium, like a slightly larger business, you're going to get a lot of information. You're going to get contracts. You're going to get half answers. You might get access to the sellers to ask them questions. You absolutely might not. So it's a bit of an investigation piece to try and pick apart what they've got, and we're trying to establish risk. So one of the biggest learnings I've made, and I've seen this mistake happen time and time again by really experienced guys, is we'll do due diligence and we'll present everything. This is what we've found out. We know how many licenses they've got. We know the password policies, and we just dump a load of information on the business guys and pat ourselves on the back. We've done a great job. But in reality, and I've seen this happen, there might be one nugget of really material risk that's in that report, and that could be the only thing that's important, and it could make or break a deal. So for me, understanding the value in the business filters through to where do we focus our attention, and how do we communicate that back to the person that is negotiating the deal, which may or may not be us. An example I'll use is we acquired a business, or we're in the process, we did actually acquire them in the end, but we were going through a due diligence. It was on the continent, and it was a small technology company that effectively had a product that was able to it had an algorithm that could adjust the levels of hydrogen in heat pumps that made it more efficient. That's as technical as I can get. As you can tell, I'm not an engineer, but the value was in the product, the technology behind this product. That's where the value lay. It wasn't the people, it wasn't the customers. It was this product that we want to then sell to every single one of our customers globally. So when we looked at the due diligence, people wanted to talk about, well, where should we put the ERP? And let's talk about data migration and what's the cybersecurity outlook like. But actually, deep in the contract, it turned out that the product was owned by Siemens because they'd supported the development. So actually, if we hadn't found that one line of product, that we were buying something that wasn't owned by them, really. So it's a small example, and obviously it's quite an extreme example, and we flagged that risk, and we probably got several million off the price as a result. But it's an example where just because we're doing an operational review of the technology, actually it's critically important that we understand the reason why we're there so that we can focus our attention. And also, had I then played that risk back alongside, I'll give another example. They had a policy to change their passwords once every 12 months, which is a risk. We want to change that. So you make a note of it, but in reality, is that important pre-deal? It's really not. We know we can fix that in a day. We can fix that day one. So what I'm not going to do is put that on a report for somebody that's negotiating the deal, because they don't really care about that. That's my risk that I can worry about post-deal. But I've seen it time and time again where all of these risks are just plunked in one big list to somebody, and the really important stuff gets buried. So I'm really sorry because my iPad is locked, so I just need to enter my password again. So amuse yourself for 10 seconds. Okay, what else have I got here? Due diligence. I've talked about people value. So one thing we haven't talked, a lot of this is about technology, and Andy talked about the challenges later down the line of cultures coming together and people. Even in the due diligence side, from a technology perspective, who are we acquiring? Is it an IT leader you could use? What's the culture of the organization? Is it a really old family business? And again, Andy, use your example where you've got emotional attachments to technology. All of this stuff is really important. Okay, so I'll move on to target operating model planning. So let's say, we've done the due diligence. What they say they are. We've done the checks. We've flagged the risks. We're happy to move forward. So then here, I've put the note planning without commitment, and I find this a real challenge, certainly for an organization that is not necessarily resource rich, or you're doing many of these at one time. It's quite difficult to do that amount of investment up front not knowing whether this is going to go ahead, and I've been in scenarios, I'm sure lots of you have, where you've done a huge amount of effort and investment in terms of time just for the deal to fall apart, or the business pivots, or you make a decision that it's not the right price. So I think it's important to get that balance right, that you invest just enough that you can have a real and usable plan, but not too much that you've wasted 6 months of your life, basically. So I think that's a really important point. And I guess the output for me in this stage is a cost and a plan. It's how much is this going to cost us, and what does that plan look like? But to get to that point, we need to consider all of the things that Andy talked about, the branding, the strategy, how does the portfolio meet with our current portfolio? So this is a really, really critical point. And again, I was talking to somebody earlier about the importance of doing that pre-deal, because if you do that once the acquisition is complete, you're having to do that alongside all of the operational risks. So really, really critically important to get that balance right. And I've also put here the kind of the difference between tactical and strategic. That plan might not just be a current state and an end state. It could be, okay, well, we're not ready for the big global system, but we can't keep them where they are. So is there an interim step? Do you have a tier 2 strategy to say, okay, well, let's put them on something cloud-based and local, but it's a move to where it's secure. So yeah, all of those considerations are critically important. And then the next phase I call the dark spot, or the dark ages, because what tends to happen in my world is you do all this work and then you hand it over to someone and then it goes quiet, and it might go quiet for 7 days, and I have known that period to be 6 months, and typically that's where the deal's getting negotiated, right? So this guy's locked in a room, they're arguing over a price, you may or may not get a question, but sometimes it goes quiet. And yeah, so I wanted to acknowledge that, because sometimes that can be a challenge, again, talking about, having invested all that time, and then actually you just get a bit of a quiet period where you're not necessarily in the loop. And then you either say, nope, the deal's not gone ahead, we've shelved the deal, or the deal completes, and then we move to completion, and suddenly there we own this organization. So the next phase I've called the first 30, which I talked about. So yeah, what do we do here? And on my notes I've put risk. So day one, it's about risk mitigation. It's what do we do to secure the investment and this value that we've just brought on? Is it password protection, making sure you've got no single points of failure? Is it getting administration access? All of these things that are critically important for day one that we should have clarified in our target operating model planning session. I put visibility here, and what I mean here is, in that first 30, up until this point, we've largely had a technology view. It's about what do we need to do, what does the tech look like? But in that first 30 days, what I've found is very, very quickly, every other department that have been focused on themselves, for example, HR, procurement, health and safety, all of these areas of the organization that are also doing due diligence, they suddenly need access. They want, oh, can you just get me access to this system? And we want a closer look on the finances now we own them. Can you get me access over here? So actually, our world suddenly opens up to the entire organization, and everyone's looking at IT because we control the access. And that needs to be thought about in advance, because it needs to be done in a controlled way. So that's a really critical point for the first 30. Longer term, so I've put, so this is effectively, it could be 6 months, 12 months, 5 years. Branding is a really important one. Again, Andy's got much more experience than me. From a Johnson Controls perspective, we have multiple brands. So I talked about Tyco and ADT and our overarching Johnson Controls brand. But we've also bought over 20 fire and security businesses, and some of them have got a fantastic brand in a niche where we want to keep them where they are. Others, we want to bring them in, and we think we can retain the value by bringing them across. But really, that very much, the IT strategy and how we plan that out is that's more often than not, that's the biggest factor which determines our ERP plan. Economies of scale, so the obvious stuff, have we just inherited a big IT team, a finance team, a marketing team? Do we want to keep them, or do we want to get savings and make redundancies, and as a result get benefit for the business? What does IT need to do to support that? Often it's that could be hanging off the back of an ERP consolidation, or it could be giving access to other systems. I've talked again, I'm typically from an IT background, not necessarily a product background, but again, talking about how does the core products fit in with your existing product portfolio, and all of these things will make are key contributors to defining the longer term strategy. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to the question at the start. Let's see if this works. So I put, yeah, what would you say is the most critical factor, or the most determining factor as to whether or not it's a successful acquisition or not? Anyone want to help me out?
Due diligence.
Say that again, sorry?
Due diligence.
Due diligence, okay, that's a good one. Yeah, sorry?
Planning.
Planning in advance, absolutely.
Very
Yeah.
senior buy-in.
Say that again?
Very senior buy-in.
Very senior buy-in, absolutely. Yeah, all good answers. So it's a bit of a trick question because ultimately I don't really believe that there is one factor. It's a bit like asking what's the secret sauce to a business being successful. There isn't one. It's kind of, when you acquire a business, you acquire the entire organization. So there's not one thing that's going to make that successful. It's so varied. There's so many things that can go wrong. It's the same amount of things that could go wrong in your current business that I actually think that, you know, there's an acceptance that needs to come with that when you work in M&A, sometimes things just don't work and it's not in your control. Like any business, some businesses don't always work. So yeah, so sorry for that bit of a trick question. Thank you for those answers.
An example of sort of what a failure looks like and what sort of happens.
Absolutely, I've got lots of examples. So yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really good question, and I think you know, when I've worked with some of the really you know, the business leadership, and this is a conversation, you know, I had many years ago, but actually they said, you know, when you're working on it, you need to accept that that's going to happen, you know. And I think she said to me, she was, I won't say who it was, but it's one of our great leaders. She said, if 2 out of 3 work, I'm happy. If 2 out of 3 are successful. So an example would be you buy an organization for a geographical region, right? And you bring them across and you consolidate the branding on the basis that you think you're going to retain those customers, but ultimately not all. There are customers that don't want to work with a $30 billion company, you know, and I would totally understand that. They're used to picking up the phone and speaking to Jill, who they've spoken to every week for the last 10 years. And no matter what you do to try and bridge that gap from a consolidation perspective, that customer's never going to stay. Ultimately, over the test of time, you can try and pretend to be a smaller organization, but if you want to consolidate, which we do, there's always going to be a bit of a clash there. So I think it actually comes back to right at the start, you know, why are you buying this business, and does that fit into the global strategy of consolidation? And there's an argument to say there are times that both the organizations that I've worked in M&A with have sometimes got that wrong. Sometimes you buy a company and their customer base just isn't a cultural fit. So yeah, that's one example. Another really big example, which is not technology driven, but I'll touch on a little bit later on, is the people side. You know, a lot of these businesses of, let's say, between 10 million and 50 million size revenue, they're former family businesses that have grown their family business and they've exited it, you know, however many million they've got plenty in the bank, and we've tried to keep them on to retain the business. And it's very difficult, not that I would know, it's very difficult to go from being the boss of a 50 million company to being one of 50 senior managers in a global organization, and a lot of people struggle with that. So I've seen people set up rival companies, take business, you sabotage organizations. You know, there's a whole host of stuff that comes with that. You know, so I've seen multiple examples, but again, there are things you can do to mitigate those risks, but not eradicate them. So yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, no problem. Okay, so that's the process. And the other bit I wanted to talk about was, yeah, the people side, the kind of the talent side, and why would I want to work in an M&A environment, or why wouldn't I? So I've kind of tried to list out first all the negative things about working in M&A, and then we can finish on a positive. Is my attempt. I've put it's difficult. It is difficult. It's a challenging, ever-changing, difficult environment. Managing the culture shift. I've put, so, you know, we talked about the culture shift for the person that's selling the business, but actually that's the same for the people that work there as well. You know, early on in my career, I've been the guy that works for a 50-person company, and someone comes in and goes, oh, by the way, we've sold the business, and now you work for a, you know, 5,000-person company, and you work for these guys in America. And that's scary, because a lot of these people have been there a long time. It's a big, and everything that comes with that as well is a big culture shift, and being involved in that process can be difficult. Something else I wanted to touch on, which is more relevant to technology. So it's that it is the culture shift. I guess from an IT perspective, I'm naturally biased towards the governance and the support side. But I put agility, so the culture shift on agility. So in a smaller business, we're used to working in an agile way. I'm an agile proponent. I worked for an agile consulting firm, but now I find myself arguing for a slightly less agile approach because I'm dealing with the technical debt from 20 years of people being agile. So where you lose the ability to ask John to quickly make that functional change on the system, when John retires, we're leaving a big problem. And having been involved in organisations where they're 10, 20 years down the line, that culture shift is really difficult to both be a part of and justify back to senior leadership, because from a technology perspective, I actually think that's probably the right thing to do when you're working with a larger organisation. So I've found that to be quite difficult. Transition from short term to long term, I've put. So again, it's kind of in line with that agility phase. When a smaller organisation, they're focused on this year's profit, or they're looking maybe 1-2 years in advance. In a global organisation or a bigger organisation, you're probably looking 3, 5, maybe more. And again, that culture shift, not just from a people and financial perspective, but from technology, that's a big difference, and that can be quite difficult to look not just at the end of your nose, but a little bit further in the future. I've put you're often working in a highly confidential way. I think that's really important, actually, because you need an outlet, and we all moan to somebody, hopefully, about work, and work's difficult. But when you're working on a really highly confidential piece of work, or you've signed a non-disclosure agreement, I think that can affect. I've seen people get quite badly affected by that, where they're used to, talking to mentors or letting off steam by having a rant about something. Often when you're in an M&A environment, you can't do that because of the nature of it. So I think just from a people perspective, it's important to be aware of that, and not everyone is going to be able to cope with it. We talked earlier about you can often spend time working on a deal that doesn't get done. Again, that can affect people. That can be quite frustrating to work, put several months into, I don't know, defining a transition service agreement or a due diligence pack, and then that deal doesn't happen. Just from a personal perspective, I've seen people affected quite badly from that. So again, M&A isn't for everyone. And then the last one I put, which I've already mentioned this, but not all acquisitions work out. You can do everything right. You can buy the company. You can, markets change, economies change, competitors are changing all the time. There are so many variables when it comes to acquisitions that I think there's an acceptance that just sometimes it's not going to work out. And again, from a personal perspective, when you're working in that environment, it's important to accept that. So, okay, so they're all the negatives, and there are some positives, and obviously I like it because that's what I've been involved in. So I'll talk about the positives and then we can finish. I put people, so you get to meet so many different people, working with entrepreneurs like the guy who, set up his family business and built it to 50 million, like fascinating people that you can learn a huge amount from. They're entrepreneurial, innovative people. It's difficult, so there's challenges, but it's a real positive to do that. I've put you work with every tech layer, so I don't have a technical background, but I can imagine a lot of you guys do, and I think it's relatively rare to find an expert in every layer of technology, although I've never met one yet. But I think with M&A, because you inherit a full stack, you have to know a bit about everything at component level. So I think it's a fantastic learning opportunity to learn about other areas of technology. If you've, for example, been an infrastructure engineer, you need to know about applications or integrations or end user computing. So I think from that perspective, it's a really good area for learning. Put exposure to SMEs and corporate. So if you're from a corporate environment and that's where you've stayed, you get exposure to these small, lean, agile businesses. And in the same way that I talked about the culture shift from the SMEs moving to a more agile way, from a more agile environment to a more corporate environment, there's also lessons that we can learn to be more lean in the other direction as well. So I think learning and exposure is a fantastic opportunity. You get to fix problems, I've put. So, I suspect everyone in this room gets value and kind of intrinsic kind of personal satisfaction from fixing stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't be working in technology. But the problems in M&A I found are some of the most difficult problems to solve because it's a little bit technical and a bit of culture. And then we've got this person over here, and you've got to kind of assess the options and present different challenges, and they're ever moving. I find that extremely rewarding. So as a career opportunity, I'd always recommend moving into M&A for that reason. And then the final one I've put is, I think it's the perfect step into ahead of an IT director or a CIO position. So I would always say this is so if you've got like, I don't know, a really ambitious project manager or a business analyst or somebody that wants to move their trajectory up, I think M&A is the perfect middle step. It's a step that I took, but it breeds that ownership mentality. When you inherit an organization, you inherit a full stack of technology. So with that, you almost instantly become the head of IT, even if you're just a transition manager, for example. So I think you need to worry about laptops and 365 licenses and ERPs and everything. So you naturally become the person that makes the decisions on that slightly smaller scale. So I think it's a perfect step in, and you know, I found that really useful. So just to summarize, I think it's super important from a technology perspective. We understand the values of why are we buying this company? What is the value that's being brought? And we use that to focus our energies throughout the entire process. Every deal is different, so we have to adapt our style and focus accordingly. And I do genuinely think there's huge career opportunities and a very rewarding career working in M&A. So with that, I will close and open the floor to questions. Go for it.
I mean, you're manufacturing or building type?
It's a bit of everything. So it's air conditioning, it's fire and security, it's building controls, manufacturing, and everything in between. Yeah.
And Andy is obviously trapped, but I'm interested in if it's not a technology area, as in the business is not about technology, in those examples, do you get involved in, from a technical DB perspective, on what could impact the value of the deal? Buying value, yeah. So the value of the target organisation. Do you get access? You know, what amount of investment is required from a technology perspective following this acquisition? So, particularly specifically for deal valuation.
So the short answer is yes, we do. I think historically, and in the, you know, one of the previous organisations I was involved in, they didn't. You know, I've seen examples where IT were kind of seen as, well, we'll just let them know when we need to let them know. In my current organisation, I've effectively won that argument to be part of the conversation during target identification, specifically for the reasons I've described. And that's because, you know, technology can be a useful tool, but it can also be really critical to the value of the business. So the example I gave where we were buying a product and the value of the business that we were buying was in that product, the due diligence from a technology perspective was so critical to that deal. So when we raised the material risk, we lowered our valuation because we were able to clearly articulate that the product we were buying was not actually owned by them. And we fixed that problem by agreeing a support agreement with Siemens, and we were able to get over that hurdle, but ultimately it led to a lower valuation and save money. So the short answer is yes, and I think, but not every IT department and technology department will be involved at that early stage. But part of what this really is a pitch to be at the that's what it is. It's a pitch to be involved early, and it's almost the same argument that a lot of IT digital technology leaders are having across the globe at the moment is give us a seat at the table. We're not just a cost base that, you know, that's gonna shove your data around and give you financial tracking. We can add value to your business. We can help the decision making. So really, it's the same argument I would argue that a lot of technology leaders are having. Yes.
So a friend of mine just sold his business.
Okay.
He's now thinking that it was the wrong move. How long ago should he accept something was wrong? Because he went through that really rapid due diligence, and maybe 10 minutes in, and both parties were like,
I think I might know that guy. No, I'm joking. So I think so that happens, right? I've seen that happen multiple times. I've seen that happen 3-4 years after the deal has happened, actually. So I don't think there is a time frame for that. I think there's two ways to look at it. There's the seller's regret, right? That happens all the time. People, they think they want the money, and then they get the money in the bank, and then actually what they want is to own their own family business, and that happens all the time. And I think you can have that in isolation, but it still be the right deal for us as a buyer, and I've typically been in the buyer scenario. So I think that's okay, actually, as long as a buying organisation, as the acquiring organisation, if the seller gets upset or is not happy, there's a way for us to win still there is that as long as we've got the value and we can manage that and we can do it in a controlled way, that's kind of a risk that I'd be willing to accept, actually. It's kind of ruthless to say it, but that's the truth, is that actually sometimes we know that's going to happen, but it still could be successful and we'll still get the value. I think if it's both parties not happy, then yeah, that probably falls into the 1 in 3 that I talked about that would not be successful, and that happens. I guess in that scenario, it's about what value can we retain. It might not be the value that we projected and that we wanted, but can we keep 50% of the customers, for example, or could we find a way to pivot and provide a different offering or try a totally new brand? There's multiple things we can do, but yeah, I mean that happens, and it's one of those things that it doesn't have an easy answer, basically, but it happens. There's a lot of experience in the room. I don't know whether anyone else wants to contribute to that. Oh, sorry, there's another question at the back. One. I'll come back to you.
How often does escrow forthcoming? Is it always sometimes you want your IT assets held safely, the passwords, the databases, Twitter, all of that? The deals would have been very small. It's not going to be something that would enter into, but the size of it was also about how protected you get and how controlling you ownership.
So good. So I don't have experience of escrow specifically, but in terms of that control, that transfer of ownership, I think so. There's two things. There's kind of I touched on a transition service agreement. So you would typically that would form part, certainly for a bigger deal where if it's a carve out, so we're only buying a portion of the business and you need to continue leveraging support services for another company for a period of time, then it's about making sure that you've got an effective and robust transition services agreement and all parties have agreed what that looks like. In terms of pre-deal, obviously all of the data's held in a secure data room, and we've got all lawyers that would make sure that that's above board. But yeah, in terms of my experience typically has been where we're buying the whole company. So it's almost from day -1 you don't have control, and day 1 you have control. So a lot of it is you've got to act quickly. So yeah, I don't have any experience specifically of the escrow process unless anyone else wants to contribute.
Used escrow not for M&A, but certainly for de-risking, working with small vendors. So a SaaS product somewhere that they are still a startup, and there's a good chance that you're the customer that they either succeed because of or fail without. So using escrow to de-risk that, and so we've got good instructions of how to run it ourselves if we had to, and this kind of thing, but not explicitly in M&A. So, practically, when you do that transition, when you've got that inventory, you write some code immediately and then passwords and keys to the key, or if that's something you just trust.
So just for those that couldn't hear, you're basically saying on day 1, do you physically hand across, are the passwords and keys to the kingdom hands across, or is there a level of trust? And it's a really, really good question that for legal reasons I can't specifically talk about, but it's an extremely topical question. So the short answer is that there's a level of trust. That's the short answer. But in reality, it's that we would typically they'll have a support contract in place with a smaller IT vendor. Typically organizations of the size that we would target, so let's say 20, 30 million, they might have a small local IT support company that they would come out and get IT support if they need to. So we would engage them on day 1. Basically, as part of due diligence, we would review the contract with that organization. If they didn't have a contract, that would be one of our day 1 to 7 activities, is to firm up that support, or it would be highlighted as a risk. But typically, no, we don't swarm the business and stick them on our network day 1. We don't do that. We typically would keep the current support contract in place. We might remove single points of failure. So in the example where you've got one bloke who's an admin and he's been the only admin for a month, we'll put in 2 or 3, so we've got visibility in enough people. But typically we keep the support in place, but put a layer of governance over the top. We speak to them, ask about their processes, and we define that support contract. But yeah, it's a good question. Any other questions? Are we done?
One more.
Okay. Liz, go on.
One of the biggest challenges I've experienced has been two companies coming together, both with some vast portfolio change programme on one side and the other. Both screen regulation has to be done. How might or have you tackled some of those challenges? It was always very, very painful, but I'd like to hear some advice too.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that falls under the category of things that doesn't have an easy answer, right? But there are ways to deal with it. I think in that specific example where so we're talking about a merger, two organisations of similar size, they've both got change programmes, both regulatory. Yeah, that's the tough one. I think I would argue in that case, you know, there'd be 1,000 questions that we'd need to clarify. We'd validate whether those things are true, whether it really is, you know, regulatory. I think in that argument, there is an argument to almost retain the status quo so they can get themselves to a position of in compliance before you wanted to define the next step. I think that would make sense. I think if you're trying to stop halfway through two regulatory compliant projects and try to combine those, that sounds like a bit of a recipe for disaster. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay, thank you. Cheers, guys. Thank you.